Picture the Mediterranean world around 500 BCE. Rome was nothing, a small city-state in central Italy, one settlement among hundreds, controlling perhaps a few hundred square miles of territory. Unremarkable, poor, surrounded by stronger, wealthier, more sophisticated neighbors. The Etruscans to the north had better technology, better art, better everything. The Greek colonies to the south were centers of culture, philosophy, and trade. The Carthaginians controlled the western Mediterranean's commerce. The great kingdoms of the east, the remnants of Alexander's empire, the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in Syria, these were the real powers, the civilizations that mattered. Rome was none of these things. It was a backwater, a collection of farmers and shepherds living on 7 hills next to a river. They spoke Latin, a language nobody else cared about. They had no great thinkers, no impressive monuments, no significant wealth. If you'd asked anyone in 500 BCE which city-state would eventually rule the entire Mediterranean world, Rome wouldn't have made the top 100. It would have seemed absurd, laughable. And yet, by 117 CE, under the Emperor Trajan, Rome controlled an empire stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine and Danube rivers to the Sahara Desert. Every coast of the Mediterranean Sea was Roman territory, an empire so vast that it took months to travel from one end to the other. So wealthy that Rome itself became the largest city in the world, home to over 1 million people. So powerful that it shaped the development of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East for centuries, creating a cultural and political legacy that persists today. How did this happen? How did an insignificant Italian city-state become the dominant power of the ancient world? The answer isn't simple. It wasn't military genius, though Rome produced capable generals. It wasn't technological superiority. Rome borrowed most of its technology from others. It wasn't divine favor, though Romans believed that too. It was something more mundane, more boring, more relentless. It was persistence, adaptability, a willingness to absorb punishment and keep going. A political system that for centuries channeled aristocratic competition into military expansion rather than civil war. A culture that valued military service above almost everything else. And perhaps most importantly, a strategic position in Italy that forced Rome to fight constantly, creating a military machine that eventually couldn't be stopped. This is the story of how Rome gradually took over the ancient world, not through a master plan conceived by visionary leaders, not through sudden dramatic conquests, but through hundreds of small wars fought over centuries, each one adding a little more territory, a few more allies, a bit more strength, until Rome found itself so powerful that no one could challenge it anymore. It's a story of incremental expansion, of strategic opportunism, of learning from defeats and exploiting victories, of institutional advantages that compounded over time. It's a story that took 600 years to unfold, from Rome's earliest wars with its immediate neighbors to the final consolidation of the empire under Augustus. And here's what makes it boring history, the kind that helps you sleep. Most of it wasn't dramatic. Most of it was bureaucratic decisions about treaties and alliances, administrative reforms that made the army more effective, economic policies that funded expansion, legal innovations that integrated conquered peoples, trade networks that made conquest profitable. The kind of details that historians love, but that never make it into movies because they're too slow, too technical, too unglamorous. But those boring details explain how it actually happened. Not the dramatic battles, though we'll cover those too. Not the legendary generals, though they mattered. But the systems, the institutions, the accumulated advantages that made Rome's rise inevitable once certain patterns were established. Because Rome didn't conquer the ancient world through brilliance. It conquered through persistence, through refusing to quit even when everything seemed lost, through learning from mistakes, through slowly, methodically building advantages that eventually became overwhelming. So tonight, we're going to walk through it all, starting with Rome's earliest wars, when survival was uncertain and neighbors constantly threatened. Moving through the conquest of Italy, the titanic struggle with Carthage, the eastern conquests that brought unimaginable wealth, and finally the civil wars that transformed republic into empire. We'll explore how Rome fought, how it governed, how it integrated conquered peoples, how it funded endless warfare, how it maintained control over territories scattered across 3 continents. It's going to be detailed, technical, obsessive, and absolutely fascinating once you see how all the pieces fit. Together, how each stage of expansion created the conditions for the next stage, how Rome's success bred more success until the whole Mediterranean world fell under its control almost inevitably, not because it was destined by the gods, but because the systems Rome created made any other outcome increasingly unlikely. And it all started in the mud and blood of central Italy, where a small city on 7 hills fought for survival against neighbors who seemed, at the time, far more likely to succeed. The story begins not with Rome's triumphs, but with its vulnerability. The city that would eventually rule the world spent its early centuries desperately fighting for survival against enemies who were, frankly, more impressive in almost every way. The Etruscans, occupying modern Tuscany, had developed a sophisticated urban civilization centuries before Rome mattered. They had cities with paved streets, drainage systems, impressive temples. They traded extensively with the Greeks and Phoenicians. They had art, culture, a written language. They looked down on the Latin-speaking farmers to their south the way later Romans would look down on Germanic barbarians. To the east and south, other Latin cities competed with Rome for dominance in the Latium region. These cities, sharing language and culture with Rome, were natural rivals. To the south, Greek colonies like Neapolis, modern Naples, and Tarentum represented the pinnacle of Mediterranean civilization. Philosophy, drama, architecture all flourished in these Greek cities, while Rome remained provincial and crude. The Romans themselves, in these early centuries, from roughly 750 to 500 BCE, were a warrior society organized around military service. Political power belonged to those who could afford the equipment to fight as heavy infantry. The wealthiest citizens, the patricians, dominated politics and the military. Below them, the plebeians, common citizens who owned enough property to serve in the army, fought for a voice in government. At the bottom, the propertyless citizens who couldn't afford military equipment had no political rights at all. This connection between military service and political power would define Roman history for centuries. You earned the right to participate in government by risking your life in Rome's wars. The more you contributed militarily, the more political influence you had. This created a society intensely focused on warfare, where military success was the primary path to political advancement, where aristocratic families competed to produce successful generals, where expansion fed political ambition and political ambition fed expansion. Rome's earliest wars were defensive, or at least started that way. The Etruscans had actually ruled Rome for a period in the 6th century BCE. The last Roman king, Tarquinius Superbus, was Etruscan, and his overthrow around 509 BCE marked both the beginning of the Republic and the beginning of Rome's wars with its former masters. The Etruscans tried repeatedly to retake Rome, or at least force it back into submission. These wars dragged on for decades, creating an existential threat that shaped Roman military culture. At the same time, Rome fought constantly with neighboring Latin cities. These were small-scale conflicts by later standards. Armies of a few thousand men fighting over a few miles of territory, over grazing rights, over honor, over anything that gave an excuse for war. But they were bitter, sustained, and formative. Rome learned to fight during these wars. It developed the tactical systems, the institutional frameworks, the cultural values that would later serve it so well. The Roman army of this early period fought as a phalanx, a dense formation of heavily armed infantry borrowed from the Greeks. Soldiers provided their own equipment. The wealthiest fought in the front ranks with the best armor and weapons. The middle class fought behind them with less expensive equipment. The poor fought as skirmishers if they fought at all. It was an aristocratic system where wealth determined your role in battle and your share of glory. But Rome's enemies forced adaptation. Fighting in the hills and valleys of central Italy, the rigid phalanx proved awkward and vulnerable. Roman commanders began experimenting with more flexible formations. The legion, Rome's signature military unit, emerged from these experiments. Instead of one solid block of soldiers, the legion organized men into smaller units called maniples that could maneuver independently. These maniples could adapt to terrain, could spread out or concentrate as needed, could maintain cohesion when the phalanx would have broken apart. This tactical innovation gave Rome an advantage over neighbors still fighting in traditional phalanxes. Not an overwhelming advantage. Rome still lost battles regularly, but an edge. Combined with Rome's willingness to absorb casualties and keep fighting, this edge accumulated into dominance over time. By 396 BCE, Rome had captured Veii, the nearest major Etruscan city, after a siege lasting 10 years. This was Rome's first significant expansion, doubling its territory and providing a psychological boost. Rome could defeat its supposedly superior neighbors. It wasn't destined to remain a minor city-state forever, but success bred problems. In 390 BCE, a Gallic tribe swept down from the north, defeated a Roman army at the Battle of the Allia, and sacked Rome itself. The city burned. The Gauls occupied it for months before withdrawing, allegedly after being paid a massive ransom. This disaster traumatized Rome. The memory of Gallic warriors inside their city, burning their temples, humiliating their pride, became a wound that never fully healed. It drove Roman strategic thinking for centuries, creating a paranoia about northern invasions that influenced everything from fortification programs to expansion into Gaul hundreds of years later. The Gallic sack also demonstrated a hard truth. Military success didn't guarantee security. You could defeat all your current enemies and still be vulnerable to new threats appearing unexpectedly. The only real security was expansion. Control enough territory, and you'd have buffer zones protecting the heartland. Defeat enough enemies and potential threats would be too distant to matter. This logic, once accepted, justified endless expansion. There was always another potential threat beyond the current borders, always another enemy who might someday invade, if not preemptively conquered or neutralized. After recovering from the Gallic disaster, Rome resumed expansion, now more aggressively. It fought the other Latin cities, forcing them into a subordinate alliance. It pushed into the Apennine Mountains, fighting the Samnites, tough mountain warriors who resisted for decades. These Samnite wars, lasting from 343 to 290 BCE with interruptions, were brutal, grinding conflicts where Rome suffered major defeats but refused to accept them as final. The Samnites won battles, inflicted humiliating defeats, even trapped entire Roman armies, but they couldn't make Rome quit. Rome just raised new armies and came back. This persistence was Rome's greatest strength in the early period. Other city-states, when defeated badly, might seek peace, accepting unfavorable terms to avoid further losses. Rome didn't. It would accept almost any sacrifice, any casualties, any humiliation, as long as it could keep fighting. The state mobilized every available resource for war. Citizens who couldn't afford equipment were armed from public funds. Allies were called on for troops even when they were exhausted. The aristocratic families competed to produce generals willing to sacrifice armies in pursuit of victory. This created a terrible arithmetic that Rome's enemies couldn't match. Rome's population was growing through conquest and alliance. It could replace casualties that would have crippled smaller states. It could field multiple armies simultaneously, meaning defeating one Roman army accomplished nothing if two more were marching toward you. And critically, Rome's political system rewarded generals who won while punishing those who accepted defeat. A general who surrendered or agreed to unfavorable peace terms faced political destruction when he returned home. Better to keep fighting, keep sacrificing soldiers, keep pursuing victory no matter the cost. The Samnites learned this to their sorrow. They won battles, but couldn't win the war because Rome wouldn't accept that the war was lost. Eventually, through sheer attrition and persistence, Rome wore them down, conquered their territories, and absorbed them into the expanding Roman alliance system. By 290 BCE, Rome controlled most of central Italy, either directly or through allied cities forced into subordinate status. This alliance system became crucial to Roman expansion. Rome didn't destroy defeated enemies, at least not the Italian ones. Instead, it offered them alliance, integrating them into a system where they retained some autonomy but had to provide troops for Roman wars. The exact terms varied. Some cities received full Roman citizenship, making their people legally Roman. Others became allies with treaty obligations. The worst off were colonies where Rome settled its own citizens on confiscated land, creating military outposts in conquered territory. The genius of this system was that it turned defeated enemies into resources for future wars. An allied city that had fought against Rome now had to send troops to fight for Rome. These allied contingents, fighting alongside Roman legions, expanded Rome's military capacity exponentially. By the 3rd century BCE, Rome could field armies totaling over 100,000 men, an enormous force for the ancient world, because it was drawing on the manpower of dozens of allied cities across Italy, and those allies had incentives to fight effectively. Success in Roman wars meant plunder, glory, and potentially Roman citizenship for allied communities that served well. The system aligned their interests with Rome's, making rebellion less attractive than cooperation, at least as long as Rome kept winning. This created a reinforcing cycle. Military success brought new allies provided more troops for future wars, more troops enabled bigger military successes, which brought more allies, and so on. By 280 BCE, Rome dominated central and southern Italy. It had defeated or allied with all the major Italian powers, except the Greek cities in the extreme south. These cities, wealthy and culturally sophisticated, watched Rome's rise with alarm. When Tarentum, the leading Greek city in southern Italy, came into conflict with Rome, it called for help from across the Adriatic. Pyrrhus, king of Epirus and one of the age's great generals, answered the call. He brought a professional army, including elephants, war elephants that terrified soldiers who'd never seen them. Before and modern military techniques learned from the wars of Alexander's successors. Pyrrhus defeated the Romans repeatedly, at Heraclea in 280 BCE and Asculum in 279 BCE. His phalanx and elephants smashed the legions, inflicting heavy casualties. But Rome kept fighting. It raised new armies. It adapted tactics, learning to counter the elephants and phalanx. And crucially, it maintained its alliances. The Italian allies didn't defect despite Rome's defeats. They kept providing troops, kept supporting the war effort, kept believing that Rome would ultimately prevail. Pyrrhus famously remarked after Asculum that another victory like that would ruin him, the origin of the term Pyrrhic victory. He was bleeding his limited army in victories that didn't end the war. Rome's losses were terrible too, but Rome could replace them. Pyrrhus couldn't. When he finally withdrew from Italy, giving up on the Greek cities he'd come to defend, it wasn't because he'd been defeated militarily. He'd won every major battle. He left because he understood that Rome's resources and persistence made final victory impossible. The war could have continued indefinitely, with Rome absorbing losses and coming back until Pyrrhus's army was destroyed. This was the pattern Rome would repeat throughout its expansion. Take horrific casualties, suffer humiliating defeats, lose battles, sometimes lose armies, but never quit. Never accept that the war was lost. Keep raising troops, keep finding allies, keep fighting until the enemy's will or resources broke first. It was brutally effective, and it worked because Rome's political and social systems were organized around warfare in ways that let it sustain efforts that would have destroyed other states. By 270 BCE, after Pyrrhus withdrew, Rome conquered the last independent Greek cities in southern Italy. It now controlled the entire Italian peninsula south of the Po River Valley. In less than 3 centuries, Rome had gone from one unremarkable city-state to the dominant power in Italy, ruling over a coalition of allied cities that could field the largest armies in the Western Mediterranean. And this was just the beginning. The next stage of expansion would be more dramatic, more costly, and more consequential. Rome was about to collide with the other great power of the Western Mediterranean, Carthage, in a series of wars that would determine which city would dominate the entire region. The wars with Carthage, known to history as the Punic Wars, were the defining conflicts of the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE. They were total wars, fought with every resource both powers could mobilize, lasting decades, destroying entire generations, reshaping the Mediterranean world. And they began almost accidentally over a minor dispute in Sicily that escalated into a death struggle between 2 expanding empires. Carthage was everything Rome wasn't: ancient, wealthy, sophisticated. founded by Phoenician colonists from Tyre around 814 BCE. Carthage had grown into a commercial empire dominating the western Mediterranean. It controlled North Africa from modern Tunisia west to Morocco, southern Spain with its rich silver mines, Sardinia, Corsica, and western Sicily. Carthaginian ships traded throughout the Mediterranean, bringing wealth that made Carthage one of the richest cities in the ancient world. Carthage's military was professional. Unlike Rome's citizen soldiers, Carthaginians hired mercenaries, troops from Spain, Gaul, Numidia, Libya, all paid by Carthaginian silver and commanded by Carthaginian aristocrats. This system had advantages. Professional soldiers were skilled and experienced. You didn't have to train farmers to fight. But it also had weaknesses. Mercenaries fought for pay, not patriotism. If you couldn't pay them, they might desert or revolt. And Carthage's population was small, perhaps 400,000 in the city and nearby territories, meaning it couldn't match Rome's manpower in a sustained conflict. The First Punic War began in 264 BCE, when Rome intervened in a dispute in Messana, a city in northeastern Sicily. Messana had been seized by Italian mercenaries who asked Rome for help when threatened by Syracuse, the most powerful Greek city in Sicily, and by Carthage. Roman intervention brought it into conflict with Carthage, which considered Sicily its sphere of influence. Both powers sent armies. Neither was willing to back down, and for 23 years they fought over Sicily in a grinding war of attrition that neither side seemed able to win decisively. The problem for Rome was that it wasn't a naval power. Carthage dominated the seas with a fleet honed by centuries of Mediterranean trade and warfare. Rome, a land power, couldn't challenge Carthage at sea, which meant it couldn't prevent Carthage from resupplying its forces in Sicily or raiding the Italian coast. Rome needed a navy, but it had essentially no naval tradition, no shipbuilding expertise, no trained rowers or admirals. Rome's solution was characteristically stubborn and ambitious. It decided to build a fleet from nothing. Using a captured Carthaginian ship as a model, Roman shipwrights constructed quinqueremes, large warships with 5 banks of oars. They built 100 ships in 60 days, according to tradition. Probably an exaggeration, but it was still remarkably fast. They trained crews on land, teaching rowers the motions using mock ships before putting them in actual vessels. And they invented the corvus, a boarding bridge that could be dropped onto enemy ships, turning naval battles into infantry battles, where Rome's legionaries had the advantage. This worked, sort of. Rome won naval battles at Mylae in 260 BCE and Ecnomus in 256 BCE, demonstrating that its improvised navy could fight. But Roman ships and crews were crude compared to Carthaginian professionals. Roman fleets were destroyed by storms repeatedly because Roman captains didn't know how to navigate safely. At one point, Rome lost an entire fleet, 284 ships and perhaps 100,000 men, to a storm off Sicily. They rebuilt and lost another fleet to another storm. The losses were staggering, casualties exceeding what most states could sustain. But Rome kept building ships, kept training crews, kept fighting. The financial burden was enormous, draining the treasury and requiring forced loans from wealthy citizens. The human cost was worse. Tens of thousands of Romans and allies died in shipwrecks and naval battles. But Rome kept going because the political system demanded it. No aristocrat could build a career by advocating surrender. The competition for glory pushed them to continue no matter the cost. Meanwhile, the land war in Sicily dragged on. Roman armies besieged Carthaginian strongholds. Carthaginian forces raided Roman-controlled areas. Neither side could force a decision. Rome even tried invading North Africa in 256 BCE, landing an army near Carthage under the consul Marcus Atilius Regulus. Initially successful, Regulus defeated Carthaginian forces and marched on Carthage. But he overreached. His army was destroyed in 255 BCE by a Carthaginian force stiffened by Greek mercenaries and commanded by a Spartan general Xanthippus. Regulus was captured and, according to legend, later sent back to Rome to negotiate peace. Instead advised the Senate to refuse Carthaginian terms, then returned to Carthage, where he was tortured to death. The story is probably propaganda, but it reflected Roman values. Honor and persistence mattered more than survival. The war ground on. By the 250s BCE, both sides were exhausted. Carthage's mercenaries were unpaid and restive. Rome's treasury was empty, and its population war-weary. But Rome found one more reserve of strength. The wealthiest citizens voluntarily funded construction of a final fleet, building 200 ships with private money in a desperate effort to end the war. This fleet, commanded by the consul Gaius Lutatius Catulus, defeated the Carthaginian fleet at the Aegates Islands in 241 BCE, cutting off supplies to Carthage's forces in Sicily. Unable to continue, Carthage sued for peace. The treaty was harsh. Carthage surrendered Sicily, paid a massive indemnity, and agreed to stay out of Rome's sphere of influence. Sicily became Rome's first overseas province, not integrated into the Italian alliance system but ruled directly as conquered territory. Rome had won, but barely. The war had cost perhaps 20% of Rome's adult male population over 23 years. It had bankrupted the state multiple times. It had pushed Rome to the edge of collapse, but it had also demonstrated Roman resilience. Carthage, wealthier and more powerful at the start, had broken first. Rome's system, its ability to mobilize resources, to replace losses, to maintain political unity despite catastrophic defeats, these advantages had proved decisive, and Rome learned from the war. It now had a navy, crude but functional. It controlled Sicily, giving it resources and strategic depth. It had gained confidence that it could compete with the Mediterranean's great powers. Carthage, meanwhile, faced a disaster. Its unpaid mercenaries revolted in what became known as the Truceless War, a brutal conflict that nearly destroyed Carthage from within. While Carthage was distracted, Rome seized Sardinia and Corsica in a naked act of opportunistic aggression, violating the spirit, if not the letter, of the peace treaty. Carthage protested, but lacked the strength to respond. This betrayal, this Roman theft of territories that should have remained Carthaginian, created lasting resentment in Carthage and set the stage for the next war. That war, the Second Punic War, would be Rome's greatest crisis and its most consequential victory. It lasted from 218 to 201 BCE and featured one of history's most famous military campaigns, Hannibal's invasion of Italy. Hannibal Barca, son of Hamilcar Barca, who had commanded Carthaginian forces in the First Punic War, had sworn as a boy to hate Rome. Forever, he meant it. As commander of Carthaginian forces in Spain, he deliberately provoked war by attacking Saguntum, a city allied with Rome. When Rome demanded Carthage hand him over, Carthage refused. War resumed. Hannibal's strategy was brilliant and terrifying. Instead of waiting for Rome to bring the war to Carthage, he invaded Italy, marching from Spain through southern Gaul and crossing the Alps with an army of 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. The crossing was nightmarish. Winter storms, hostile tribes, and the sheer difficulty of moving an army through unmapped mountain passes killed many soldiers and most of the elephants. But Hannibal reached northern Italy with enough forces to begin his campaign of destruction. The next 16 years demonstrated Hannibal's genius and Rome's stubborn refusal to accept defeat. Hannibal won battle after battle, destroying Roman armies with tactical brilliance that made him a legend. At the Trebia River in 218 BCE, he ambushed and annihilated a Roman army. At Lake Trasimene in 217 BCE, he trapped another Roman force against the lake and slaughtered them, killing perhaps 15,000 Romans, including the consul. These were disasters, but they paled compared to what came next. At Cannae in 216 BCE, Hannibal achieved the perfect battle, the tactical masterpiece that military theorists still study today. He faced a Roman army of perhaps 80,000 men, the largest Rome had ever fielded, commanded by the consuls Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro. Hannibal had perhaps 50,000 troops. The Romans, confident in their numerical superiority, attacked. Hannibal's center, intentionally weakened, gave ground slowly, drawing the Romans forward. His cavalry defeated the Roman cavalry on both flanks, then circled behind the Roman infantry. His infantry wings, held back during the initial fighting, now closed in from the sides. The Romans were surrounded, packed so tightly that they couldn't fight effectively. For hours, Carthaginian forces slaughtered Romans who couldn't escape. When it ended, perhaps 50,000 to 70,000 Romans and allies were dead. One of the consuls was dead. Rome's largest army had been annihilated. Cannae should have ended the war. Most states, Suffering such a catastrophic defeat would have sued for peace on any terms available. Rome didn't. The Senate refused even to discuss peace. They executed the surviving consul for incompetence. They appointed a dictator, Quintus Fabius Maximus, who implemented a strategy of avoiding battle, shadowing Hannibal's army, cutting off foragers, harassing but never engaging directly. It was frustrating, inglorious, and effective. Hannibal couldn't bring Rome to battle and couldn't force a decision. His army lived off the land in southern Italy, unable to besiege Rome itself or force a strategic conclusion. Meanwhile, Rome mobilized. It called up every available man, arming slaves and promising them freedom if they fought. It stripped the Italian allies for troops despite the battlefield disasters, and critically, most of those allies remained loyal. Some southern Italian cities defected to Hannibal, hoping he'd win and wanting to be on the winning side. But most, including all the Latin cities and the critical central Italian allies, stayed with Rome. The alliance system held despite the catastrophe. Rome also continued fighting everywhere else. While Hannibal ravaged Italy, Roman armies fought in Spain, preventing Carthage from reinforcing him. They fought in Sicily, which had revolted against Roman rule. They even sent an army to Greece when Philip V of Macedon allied with Hannibal. Rome was fighting a multi-front war, while its largest army had just been destroyed, and somehow it kept all the fronts active. This was possible only because of Roman resources and political unity. The state mobilized wealth that would have seemed impossible. Citizens loaned money to the government. Temples contributed their treasures. Taxes were raised. Allies were bled for contributions. And every resource went to the war effort, raising armies, building ships, equipping soldiers. The Roman economy, despite battlefield disasters, didn't collapse because the political will to continue remained absolute. Hannibal spent years in southern Italy, winning skirmishes but unable to force a decision. His requests for reinforcements from Carthage went largely unanswered. Carthage's government, dominated by the peace party that opposed the Barca family, sent minimal support. In 207 BCE, Hannibal's brother Hasdrubal finally brought reinforcements from Spain, crossing the Alps with a fresh army. But the Romans, warned by intercepted messages, concentrated forces against him and destroyed his army at the Metaurus River before he could join Hannibal. Hasdrubal's head was thrown into Hannibal's camp, showing him that help would not arrive. By 203 BCE, the strategic situation had shifted decisively. A young Roman general, Publius Cornelius Scipio, had conquered Carthaginian Spain, depriving Carthage of its most valuable territories and richest resources. Scipio then did to Carthage what Hannibal had done to Rome. He invaded North Africa, landing near Carthage with an army trained and equipped based on lessons learned from fighting Hannibal. Carthage, threatened in its heartland, recalled Hannibal from Italy. He had spent 15 years undefeated in enemy territory, but he couldn't prevent Rome from winning the war. In 202 BCE, Scipio and Hannibal met at Zama in North Africa. Hannibal's army, largely composed of hastily recruited troops rather than his veterans from Italy, couldn't match the Romans. Scipio used Hannibal's own tactics, particularly the use of cavalry, to attack from the flanks and rear. Hannibal was defeated, decisively beaten for the first time in his career. Carthage sued for peace immediately. The peace terms were devastating. Carthage surrendered Spain, paid an enormous indemnity over 50 years, gave up all but 10 ships, agreed never to wage war without Roman permission, and acknowledged Roman dominance in the western Mediterranean. Carthage remained independent, but barely, reduced to a client state that existed only because Rome permitted it. And Rome had survived its greatest test. It had lost perhaps 20% of its adult male population over 16 years. It had suffered defeats that should have been fatal, but it had endured, adapted, and ultimately triumphed through sheer persistence and the strength of its alliance system. The Second Punic War transformed Rome. It emerged as the unquestioned dominant power in the western Mediterranean. Its armies had defeated the age's most brilliant general. Its political system had survived catastrophic stress. Its alliance system had held, despite disasters that should have shattered it. Rome had learned that it could endure almost anything and still win if it refused to quit. This lesson shaped everything that followed. Roman confidence, bordering on arrogance, was reinforced by the knowledge that they'd beaten Hannibal and if they could beat Hannibal, they could beat anyone. The war also fundamentally changed Roman society and culture. The long conflict had militarized Roman life even more than before. Successful generals became political superstars. Scipio, who defeated Hannibal, held prestige that dwarfed normal aristocrats. This created new political dynamics where military glory translated into political dominance, setting precedents that would eventually help destroy the Republic. The war had also brought enormous wealth through plunder and indemnities, concentrating it in the hands of the elite, who used it to buy land in Italy, creating large estates worked by slaves captured in the wars. The small farmers who'd filled the legions returned home to find their land bought up or ruined by years of war. Many sold out and migrated to Rome, creating an urban poor that would become a political force in later decades. But in the immediate aftermath, Rome was triumphant, wealthy, and increasingly confident in its military invincibility. And it wasn't done expanding. The next phase would take Rome east into the wealthy, sophisticated kingdoms that were the remnants of Alexander the Great's empire. These eastern conquests would bring wealth that dwarfed anything Rome had seen before. They would also bring cultural influences, political complications, and moral corruption that would eventually contribute to the Republic's collapse. But that was the future. In 201 BCE, Rome had just survived its greatest test and emerged stronger than ever. The gradual conquest of the ancient world was about to accelerate. The Eastern Mediterranean in the early 2nd century BCE was a world Rome barely understood. The great Hellenistic kingdoms, Macedon, the Seleucid Empire, and Ptolemaic Egypt, were the remnants of Alexander the Great's conquests. These kingdoms were wealthy, culturally sophisticated, and powerful. Their cities, Alexandria, Antioch, Pergamum, were centers of learning, art, and commerce that made Rome look provincial. Greek was the language of culture and diplomacy. Greek philosophy, literature, and art set the standards of civilization. The Eastern Mediterranean considered itself the center of the world, and it looked down on Rome as a rising but crude power from the barbarous West. Rome's involvement in the East began almost reluctantly. During the Second Punic War, Philip V of Macedon had allied with Hannibal, creating a second front that Rome could ill afford. Rome responded by allying with Greek city-states that opposed Macedonian domination, particularly the Aetolian League. These alliances pulled Rome into the complex politics of the Greek world, where city-states, leagues, and kingdoms formed and broke alliances constantly, fought wars over prestige and minor territorial adjustments, and generally operated according to rules and assumptions that Romans found both fascinating and frustrating. After defeating Carthage, Rome turned its attention to settling accounts with Philip. In 200 BCE, Rome declared war on Macedon, officially to punish Philip's alliance with Hannibal, but really to establish Roman dominance in the region. The Second Macedonian War lasted from 200 to 197 BCE and demonstrated that Roman military methods, refined through centuries of Italian warfare and the Punic Wars, were superior to the Hellenistic phalanx tactics that Eastern armies still used. At Cynocephalae in 197 BCE, a Roman army under Titus Quinctius Flamininus defeated Philip's phalanx decisively. The flexible Roman maniples could adapt to the broken terrain where the rigid Macedonian phalanx became disorganized and vulnerable. Philip sued for peace, surrendering his fleet, evacuating Greece, and paying an indemnity. But Rome didn't annex Macedon or establish direct control. Instead, Flamininus declared the Greek city-states free. At the Isthmian Games in 196 BCE, a propaganda masterstroke that portrayed Rome as a liberator rather than a conqueror. This freedom was, of course, heavily qualified. The Greek cities were free to govern themselves as long as they aligned with Roman interests and didn't challenge Roman supremacy. Rome didn't need to establish direct rule. The threat of Roman military intervention was sufficient to ensure compliance most of the time. This indirect hegemony was cheaper and easier than direct administration, allowing Rome to dominate the region without the overhead of governing it. But Rome's presence in the east created new complications. The Seleucid Empire, ruled by Antiochus III, the most powerful of Alexander's successor kingdoms, viewed Rome's intervention in Greece with alarm. Antiochus controlled a vast empire stretching from Asia Minor to the borders of India. He had reconquered much of the eastern territories his predecessors had lost, earning the title the Great. He wasn't inclined to accept Roman dictates in what he considered his sphere of influence. Tensions escalated when Hannibal, exiled from Carthage, sought refuge at Antiochus's court and allegedly advised him to invade Italy before Rome became too powerful to challenge. Whether Hannibal actually gave this advice, or whether it's Roman propaganda, Antiochus did move into Greece in 192 BCE with a small army, responding to requests from Greek cities that opposed Roman interference. Rome declared war and the Syrian War began. Antiochus's campaign was half-hearted and poorly planned. He brought insufficient forces and failed to win over many Greek allies. At Thermopylae in 191 BCE, the same pass where Spartans had fought Persians centuries earlier, a Roman army defeated Antiochus, forcing him to retreat to Asia Minor. Rome pursued, and for the first time, Roman armies crossed into Asia. At Magnesia in 190 BCE, the Romans crushed Antiochus's much larger army, destroying the Seleucid phalanx and demonstrating again that Roman tactical flexibility was superior. The peace terms were crushing. Antiochus surrendered all territory west of the Taurus Mountains in Asia Minor, paid an enormous indemnity, handed over his war elephants and most of his fleet, and agreed to stay out of Roman affairs. The Seleucid Empire, the most powerful kingdom in the east, had been humbled by the upstart Romans. The psychological impact across the eastern Mediterranean was profound. Rome, the Western barbarians, had defeated the great Hellenistic powers repeatedly. No one could match Roman military might, but Rome still didn't establish direct rule in the east. It distributed Seleucid territories to allied kingdoms like Pergamum and Rhodes, who had supported Rome during the war. It maintained the fiction of Greek freedom. It withdrew its armies from Asia, demonstrating that it had no intention of occupying conquered territory. Rome's reluctance to govern directly wasn't altruism, it was pragmatism. Direct rule was expensive, requiring garrisons, administrators, and ongoing military commitments. Indirect hegemony achieved the same strategic goals, keeping potential rivals weak and ensuring Roman interests were protected without the costs of administration. This pattern repeated throughout the 2nd century BCE. Rome intervened repeatedly in the east, crushing any power that seemed to threaten the balance Rome preferred. In 171-168 BCE, Rome fought the Third Macedonian War against Philip's son Perseus. At Pydna in 168 BCE, Roman legions destroyed the Macedonian phalanx so completely that Macedon ceased to exist as an independent kingdom. This time, Rome didn't preserve Macedonian independence. It divided the kingdom into 4 republics, theoretically independent but actually controlled by Rome. When these republics rebelled in 149 BCE, Rome finally established direct rule, creating the province of Macedonia. The destruction of Macedon sent shockwaves through the eastern Mediterranean. The kingdom that had once ruled Greece and conquered Persia had been erased by Rome. Other powers took note. The Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, already in decline, became a virtual Roman protectorate. In 168 BCE, when the Seleucid king Antiochus IV invaded Egypt, a Roman ambassador named Gaius Popilius Laenas drew a circle in the sand around Antiochus and demanded he decide whether to withdraw or fight Rome before stepping out of the circle. Antiochus, knowing he couldn't win against Rome, withdrew. The incident demonstrated Roman arrogance and power in equal measure. A single Roman ambassador could dictate terms to a king through sheer intimidation. Rome's dominance in the East by mid-2nd century BCE was absolute. The great Hellenistic kingdoms were either destroyed, like Macedon, reduced to client states, like the Seleucids and Ptolemies, or carefully maintained their pro-Roman stance to avoid destruction, like Pergamum. Greek city-states learned that challenging Rome meant annihilation. The Achaean League, a confederation of Greek cities, rebelled against Roman interference in 146 BCE. Rome responded by sacking Corinth, one of Greece's great cities, selling its population into slavery and razing it to the ground as an example. The message was clear: Roman hegemony was not negotiable, but Eastern conquests brought more than strategic dominance. They brought wealth on a scale Rome had never experienced. The indemnities paid by defeated kingdoms were enormous. The plunder from eastern campaigns was staggering. Roman generals returned from the east fabulously wealthy, bringing gold, silver, art, slaves, and luxuries that transformed Roman society. This wealth concentration created new social dynamics. The aristocrats who commanded eastern campaigns became vastly richer than their peers. They used this wealth to dominate politics, buying votes, funding political allies, building support networks that traditional Roman politics couldn't easily counter. The influx of Eastern wealth also exposed Rome to Greek culture in ways that transformed Roman civilization. Greek art, literature, philosophy, and education became fashionable among the Roman elite. Greek slaves, often educated men captured in the Eastern wars, became tutors for Roman children. Greek ideas about government, ethics, and society influenced Roman thought. Some Romans, like Scipio Aemilianus, embraced Greek culture enthusiastically, creating circles of Greek and Roman intellectuals. Others, like Cato the Elder, viewed Greek influence as corrupting, weakening Roman virtue with Eastern decadence. This cultural tension became a permanent feature of Roman life. Rome was simultaneously attracted to and repelled by Greek sophistication. It conquered Greece militarily, but was conquered culturally by Greek civilization. As the poet Horace later wrote, "Captive Greece took captive her savage conqueror." This cultural transformation made Rome more sophisticated, more cosmopolitan, more intellectually vibrant. But it also, in the eyes of traditionalists, weakened the austere Roman values that had built the empire. The debate over Greek influence became part of broader anxieties about how conquest was changing Roman society, anxieties that would intensify as expansion continued, and the Republic's political system struggled to manage the consequences. By 146 BCE, Rome dominated the Mediterranean world. It controlled Italy, Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, Spain, Macedon, Greece, and parts of North Africa. It had client kingdoms throughout the east. Its armies were undefeated. Its wealth seemed inexhaustible. But the very success created problems that would eventually tear the Republic apart. The gradual conquest of the ancient world was nearly complete, but the process of conquest had transformed Rome in ways that made the old political system increasingly unstable. The next century would see that instability explode into civil wars that would destroy the Republic even as they expanded the empire to its greatest extent. But that's getting ahead of the story. First, we need to understand how Rome governed its growing empire and how that governance shaped both the conquered and the conquerors. Governing an empire that sprawled across 3 continents required administrative innovations Rome developed gradually, often reluctantly, usually in response to immediate problems rather than through careful planning. The Roman Republic's political institutions were designed for a city-state, not an empire. The Senate, an advisory body of aristocrats who'd held high office, provided continuity and expertise. The magistrates, elected annually, held executive power, but for limited terms, to prevent anyone from accumulating too much authority. This system worked well for managing a city and its immediate territory. It struggled to manage an empire. Rome's solution was the province, a territory governed by a Roman magistrate with military and civil authority. Provinces were created ad hoc as Rome conquered new territories. Sicily, seized from Carthage, became the first province in 241 BCE. Sardinia and Corsica followed. Spain, conquered during and after the Second Punic War, was divided into 2 provinces, Nearer Spain and Farther Spain. Each province was ruled by a propraetor or proconsul, a former praetor or consul whose term of office was extended to govern the province, usually for 1 year, though extensions were common. The provincial governor had nearly absolute power in his province. He commanded the military forces stationed there. He administered justice, acting as final judge in legal disputes. He collected taxes, enriching himself in the process since governors expected to profit from their term. He represented Rome to the provincials, who learned quickly that pleasing the governor was essential to their well-being. This concentration of power in one man's hands, far from Rome and with limited oversight, created opportunities for abuse that many governors enthusiastically exploited. Taxation was particularly ripe for corruption. Rome didn't establish professional tax collection bureaucracies. Instead, it auctioned tax collection rights to private contractors called publicani. These publicans, often wealthy Romans or Italians organized into companies, paid Rome a fixed sum for the right to collect taxes in a province. Whatever they collected above that sum was their profit. This created obvious incentives to overtax provincials. The publicans squeezed the provinces, taking more than the legal tax rates, charging interest on late payments, using intimidation and connections with corrupt governors to maximize extraction. Provincials had little recourse. They could try appealing to the governor, who might be bribed by the publicans or receiving a cut of the profits. They could try sending embassies to Rome to complain, but the Senate rarely interfered with governors and publicans who were, after all, members of the Roman elite or their associates. The result was systematic exploitation. Provinces were drained of wealth to enrich Roman and Italian tax collectors and governors. Some governors were honest, trying to rule fairly and protect their provincials from the worst abuses. But many saw their governorship as an opportunity to recoup the massive expenses of their political careers and enrich themselves for retirement. A year as governor of a wealthy province like Asia or Syria could make a man fabulously rich if he wasn't too scrupulous about how he made his fortune. This exploitation created resentment that occasionally erupted into rebellion. The provinces were held down by military force, by the fear of Roman legions crushing any resistance. But the resentment simmered, waiting for any moment of Roman weakness to explode. When civil wars distracted Rome in the 1st century BCE, provinces rebelled repeatedly, hoping Roman infighting would create opportunities for independence. It never worked. Rome always won, punished the rebels savagely, and resumed extracting wealth. But not all provinces were equally exploited. Rome learned, gradually and inconsistently, to differentiate between provinces. Some, particularly those that had resisted Roman conquest violently, were governed harshly, milked for wealth, and treated as conquered enemies who needed to be kept down. Others, particularly those that had submitted peacefully or allied with Rome early, received better treatment, lower taxes, more autonomy. This differentiation created incentives for future conquests to submit rather than resist, reducing the costs of expansion. Rome also granted varying degrees of citizenship and legal status to different communities within the empire. At the top were Roman citizens, protected by Roman law, exempt from certain taxes, able to vote in Roman elections if they could travel to Rome to do so. Below them were Latins, who had most rights of Roman citizens except the vote. Then came allies with treaty rights, who retained local autonomy but had to provide troops for Roman wars. At the bottom were subjects in provinces without treaty rights, who had minimal legal protection and were most vulnerable to exploitation. This hierarchy created a ladder that communities and individuals could climb through loyal service to Rome. Communities that supported Rome in wars might be rewarded with better legal status. Individuals could earn Roman citizenship through military service. This mobility, the possibility of improving your status through cooperation with Rome, made the system more stable than it would have been if status were fixed and immobile. It gave provincials and allies reasons to work within the Roman system rather than against it. The Roman military also evolved to meet the empire's needs. The early army, based on annual levies of citizen soldiers, worked well for short Italian wars where soldiers could return home for harvest season. It worked poorly for distant campaigns in Spain or Asia, where wars dragged on for years and harvest schedules mattered less than constant military pressure on enemies. The solution was to extend service terms, keeping soldiers under arms for multiple years or even decades. This created a more professional army, soldiers who knew their trade because they had been practicing it for years. But it also created problems. Long service soldiers became more loyal to their generals than to the state. They depended on their commanders for pay, plunder, and the land grants they expected upon retirement. Generals who could provide these things earned intense loyalty from their troops. This general-soldier bond was fine when generals remained loyal to the state. It became disastrous when ambitious generals used their armies to pursue political goals or personal power. The late Republic would be torn apart by generals leading armies loyal to them personally rather than to Rome, fighting civil wars to determine who would dominate the state. But in the 2nd century BCE, this problem was only beginning to emerge. The military reforms associated with Gaius Marius in the late 2nd century BCE formalized changes that had been happening gradually for decades. Marius opened the army to the landless poor, creating a professional force that served for 16 years or more, expected to receive land grants upon discharge. This solved the immediate problem of recruitment, as Rome's traditional recruiting base, small farmers who could afford their own equipment, was shrinking due to economic changes. But it created long-term political problems as these landless soldiers looked to their generals to provide for them after service, making generals politically powerful in new and dangerous ways. The army structure continued evolving. The legion remained the basic unit, but it became more standardized. By the late 2nd century BCE, a legion consisted of about 5,000 men organized into 10 cohorts, each cohort containing multiple centuries. The equipment was standardized, provided by the state rather than the individual soldier. Training became more rigorous and systematic. The result was an army that was professional, disciplined, well-equipped, and tactically flexible, capable of fighting in any terrain and defeating any enemy it faced. This military machine made further conquest almost inevitable. Rome's armies were better trained, better equipped, better organized, and more experienced than any opponents. Combined with Rome's ability to mobilize massive resources and absorb casualties that would cripple other states, the military gave Rome overwhelming advantages. Defeating Rome required not just winning battles, but destroying its ability and will to continue fighting. Few enemies could accomplish that, and those who tried, like Hannibal, discovered that Rome's persistence made victory impossible even when every battle was won. The wealth flowing into Rome from conquered territories transformed Roman society in profound and destabilizing ways. The most visible change was the growth of the city itself. Rome's population exploded as people from throughout Italy and the empire migrated seeking opportunities. By the 1st century BCE, Rome's population probably exceeded 1 million, making it by far the largest city in the Western world. This massive urban population required enormous quantities of food, water, and entertainment. Providing these necessities became a political imperative, creating the famous policy of bread and circuses, where the state subsidized grain and public entertainment to keep the urban masses content and prevent riots. The aqueducts that brought water to Rome were engineering marvels, constructed over decades and centuries, carrying water from distant sources into the city through gravity-fed channels. The grain supply came from Sicily, North Africa, and eventually Egypt, shipped in massive quantities and distributed at subsidized prices or free to Romans, citizens. The public entertainment, gladiatorial games, chariot races, theatrical performances was funded by wealthy politicians seeking popularity and votes. The whole system was expensive, requiring constant imperial revenue to sustain. This urban population, divorced from agricultural labor and dependent on state distributions, became a political force that aristocratic politicians competed to control. The masses could be mobilized to support or oppose political initiatives. Demagogues could rise to power by promising more benefits to the plebs. The traditional politics of senatorial consensus and aristocratic competition became complicated by the need to manage and appease the urban poor, creating new forms of political conflict that the old institutions struggled to handle. The concentration of wealth also created a new class of ultra-rich Romans, whose fortunes dwarfed anything seen in earlier periods. These men, often successful generals or provincial governors, used their wealth to dominate politics, building political machines based on patronage, buying votes, funding allies, and crushing opponents. The traditional politics of rough equality among aristocrats, where wealth differences mattered but weren't overwhelming, gave way to oligarchy where a few dozen families controlled the state through sheer financial power. Slavery expanded enormously as conquests provided millions of slaves from defeated enemies. These slaves worked the large estates, latifundia, that wealthy Romans created by buying up small farms throughout Italy. The small farmers who traditionally filled the legions were pushed out, migrating to Rome or struggling on marginal land. This created a rural crisis, with depopulation of the Italian countryside and concentration of land in fewer hands. Reformers, like the Gracchi brothers in the 130s, 120s BCE, tried to address this through land redistribution programs, attempting to resettle poor citizens on public land that had been illegally occupied by the rich. These reform efforts failed, blocked by the aristocrats who benefited from the status quo, and both Gracchi were killed by political violence, setting precedents for using murder to resolve political disputes. The use of violence in politics escalated throughout the late 2nd and early 1st centuries BCE. Political gangs fought in Rome's streets, demagogues were assassinated, reformers were killed by mobs organized by their opponents. The Senate increasingly relied on declaring states of emergency that suspended normal legal protections, allowing them to kill citizens without trial. The sacred principle that Roman citizens couldn't be executed without due process eroded as political stakes rose and normal political competition transformed into life or death struggles for power. All of this was consequence of empire. The wealth-conquered territories created inequality. The provinces created opportunities for governors and publicans to enrich themselves. The long military campaigns created armies more loyal to generals than to the state. The destruction of the Italian peasantry created an urban mob dependent on state handouts. The concentration of power in the hands of successful generals created new forms of political competition the old institutions couldn't manage. The Republic was slowly being destroyed by the very success that had made Rome the dominant power in the Mediterranean. The institutions designed for a city-state couldn't handle an empire, and attempts to reform them failed because the beneficiaries of the system blocked changes that threatened their interests. By the early 1st century BCE, the stage was set for the crisis that would destroy the Republic. The social tensions, the political violence, the military's transformation into personal armies, the wealth inequality, the breakdown of traditional norms, all of these made some kind of reckoning inevitable. What pushed the Republic over the edge was a series of military and political crises that exposed the system's fundamental instability and empowered ambitious men to use armies for political ends, transforming the gradual conquest of the ancient world into civil wars that paradoxically completed that conquest even as they destroyed the Republic that had begun it. The late Republic witnessed the rise of individual strongmen who used military success to dominate politics in ways that traditional Republican norms couldn't contain. The first of these was Sulla, who in the 80s BCE fought a civil war against political rivals, marched on Rome with his army, an unprecedented violation of sacred tradition, proscribed his enemies, meaning declared them outlaws who could be killed and their property confiscated, and had himself appointed dictator with unlimited power. Sulla tried to restore the Republic, resigning his dictatorship and implementing constitutional reforms meant to strengthen the Senate and prevent future strongmen. But his reforms failed because they addressed symptoms rather than causes. The fundamental problem that successful generals commanded armies more loyal to them than to the state remained unsolved. After Sulla, the competition among ambitious aristocrats intensified. Pompey the Great emerged as the most successful general of his generation, defeating Rome's enemies in Spain, Asia, and the eastern Mediterranean. His eastern campaigns in the 60s BCE were spectacularly successful, reorganizing the entire region, creating client kingdoms, establishing new provinces, and bringing enormous wealth to Rome. Pompey returned to Italy at the head of his army in 62 BCE, and Romans feared he might follow Sulla's example and seize power. But Pompey disbanded his army and entered Rome as a private citizen, respecting Republican tradition. This restraint earned him political capital, but left him vulnerable to opponents who blocked his attempts to secure land for his veterans and ratify his eastern settlement. Pompey's frustration led him into an alliance with Julius Caesar and Marcus Licinius Crassus, Rome's richest man, forming what modern historians call the First Triumvirate. This informal alliance dominated Roman politics, using their combined wealth, military prestige, and political connections to push through legislation the Senate opposed. Caesar used this support to secure the governorship of Gaul in 58 BCE, giving him command of an army and a province where he could win the military glory and wealth he needed to compete with Pompey. Caesar's conquest of Gaul from 58 to 50 BCE was one of antiquity's most impressive military achievements. Gaul, modern France, and Belgium was divided among numerous Celtic tribes who fought among themselves but occasionally united against external threats. Caesar intervened in tribal conflicts, ostensibly to protect Rome's Gallic allies, but really to create pretexts for expansion. Over 8 years, he conquered all of Gaul, crossing the Rhine to intimidate Germanic tribes, crossing the Channel to invade Britain, fighting dozens of battles, besieging hundreds of towns, enslaving millions of Gauls. The conquest was brutal and profitable. Caesar sold so many slaves that the slave market crashed temporarily from oversupply. The plunder enriched his soldiers and himself. The military achievement made him famous throughout the Roman world. His written account of the wars, the Commentari de Bello Gallico, was both military history and political propaganda, portraying Caesar as a brilliant general and depicting the Gauls as barbarians who needed Roman civilization. The conquest added vast territories to the empire, securing Rome's northern frontier and providing resources that would sustain the empire for centuries. But it also made Caesar too powerful to fit within the republican system. His army was loyal to him personally. His wealth rivaled the states. His fame eclipsed every other living Roman. His political enemies, led by Cato the Younger and supported by Pompey, who'd broken with Caesar, demanded he disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen to face prosecution for illegal acts during his consulship. Caesar refused, knowing that without his army, he'd be destroyed politically and possibly killed. In 49 BCE, he crossed the Rubicon River with one legion, invading Italy and starting a civil war that would determine Rome's future. The civil war between Caesar and Pompey lasted from 49 to 45 BCE and was fought across the Mediterranean world. Pompey fled Italy to Greece, where he assembled an army. Caesar pursued, defeated him at Pharsalus in 48 BCE, and chased him to Egypt, where Pompey was murdered by Egyptian courtiers, hoping to win Caesar's favor. Caesar's subsequent affair with Cleopatra VII, the Egyptian queen, secured Egypt as a Roman client. Caesar then campaigned in Asia, Africa, and Spain, defeating Pompeian diehards who refused to surrender even after their leader's death. By 45 BCE, Caesar had won. He returned to Rome as dictator, effectively sole ruler despite maintaining republican forms. He implemented reforms, reorganizing the calendar, distributing land to veterans, planning massive public works, reforming provincial administration, extending citizenship more broadly. But he also accumulated honors and powers that made him appear monarchical. He was appointed dictator for life. His image appeared on coins. He sat on a golden throne in the Senate. Whether he intended to make himself king or merely enjoyed the trappings of power while planning to restore the Republic eventually, we can't know. On March 15, 44 BCE, the Ides of March, a group of senators led by Brutus and Cassius, assassinated him, stabbing him to death in the Senate meeting as he arrived. The assassins thought they were saving the Republic. They were wrong. Caesar's death triggered another round of civil wars that lasted 13 more years and resulted in the Republic's final destruction. Caesar's heir, his great-nephew Octavian, allied with Mark Antony, Caesar's right-hand man, and Marcus Lepidus, forming the Second Triumvirate. They hunted down Caesar's assassins, defeated them at Philippi in 42 BCE, and divided the empire among themselves. But this arrangement couldn't last. Octavian and Antony, both ambitious and unwilling to share power indefinitely, moved toward confrontation. Antony's alliance with Cleopatra gave Octavian the propaganda weapon he needed. He portrayed Antony as bewitched by an Eastern queen, abandoning Roman values for Oriental despotism. In 31 BCE, their forces met at Actium off western Greece in a naval battle that decided the empire's fate. Octavian's fleet, commanded by Marcus Agrippa, defeated Antony and Cleopatra's forces. The lovers fled to Egypt, where, facing inevitable defeat, they both committed suicide in 30 BCE. Octavian annexed Egypt as his personal province, making him the wealthiest man in the Roman world. With no rivals remaining, Octavian returned to Rome and faced the problem of how to rule without being assassinated like Caesar. His solution was brilliant. He restored the Republic, or claimed to. He resigned his powers, returned them to the Senate and people, and presented himself as first among equals, simply the most distinguished citizen. In reality, he kept control of the armies, the wealthiest provinces, and the practical levers of power. But he dressed his monarchy in republican forms, calling himself princeps, first citizen, rather than king or dictator. The Senate, tired of civil wars and grateful for peace, granted him the title Augustus, meaning revered one, and accumulated honors and powers that made him effectively emperor while maintaining the fiction of the republic. This was the Principate, the system Augustus created that would govern Rome for centuries. The emperor held ultimate power, but exercised it through republican institutions that were maintained even as they became irrelevant. The Senate continued meeting, debating, passing laws. Magistrates were still elected annually. But everyone understood that the emperor's will was final. As long as emperors maintained the fiction and didn't too obviously flaunt their power, the system worked, providing stability that the late republic had lost. Augustus ruled for 41 years, from 27 BCE to 14 CE, consolidating the empire and creating the administrative structures that would govern it for centuries. He established permanent military frontiers, stationing legions on the Rhine, Danube, and Euphrates to defend against Germanic tribes, Dacians, and Parthians. He reformed provincial administration, reducing corruption and exploitation, though not eliminating them. He built monuments in Rome and throughout the empire, using architecture to demonstrate Roman power and civilization. He promoted a moral revival, trying to restore traditional Roman values and reverse what he saw as the corruption that had destroyed the Republic. Under Augustus, the gradual conquest of the ancient world reached its maximum extent. The empire controlled the entire Mediterranean coastline, the most valuable and productive territories in the ancient world. Further expansion brought diminishing returns. The wealthy, urbanized regions were already conquered. What remained were the northern forests and steppes where wealth was scarce and resistance fierce. Augustus tried expanding into Germania, planning to push the frontier from the Rhine to the Elbe, but in 9 CE, 3 legions were annihilated in the Teutoburg forest by Germanic tribes. The disaster convinced Augustus that expansion should stop, that the empire should consolidate what it had, rather than overextend into territories that cost more to hold than they were worth. This represented a fundamental shift. The Republic had expanded constantly, driven by aristocratic competition for military glory and the need to keep armies employed. The Principate made expansion optional, a strategic choice rather than a political necessity. Augustus's successors sometimes expanded, conquering Britain under Claudius, Dacia under Trajan, reaching maximum extent under Trajan in 117 CE. But they also sometimes retreated, as Hadrian did, by abandoning some of Trajan's eastern conquests and building walls in Britain and Germany to mark defensible boundaries. The gradual conquest of the ancient world was complete. Rome controlled territories from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara, an empire of perhaps 60 million people, the largest political entity the Western world had yet seen. It would persist for centuries in the West, until Germanic invasions fragmented it in the 5th century CE. It would persist in the East as the Byzantine Empire for another 1,000 years after that, finally ending in 1453 when Constantinople fell to the Ottomans. But by the time of Augustus's death in 14 CE, the story we've been following, the gradual conquest that transformed Rome from a city-state to an empire, was essentially finished. The republic that had begun the expansion was dead, destroyed by the very success of its conquests. The empire that replaced it would govern the conquered territories for centuries, spreading Roman law, Latin language, Roman culture, urban civilization, Christianity eventually, creating a legacy that shaped European civilization fundamentally and permanently. Looking back across the 6 centuries, from Rome's early wars with the Etruscans to Augustus's consolidation of the empire, the expansion seems almost inevitable in retrospect. But it wasn't. At dozens of moments Rome could have failed, defeated by the Gauls in 390 BCE, crushed by Pyrrhus in the 280s, destroyed by Hannibal at Cannae, fragmented during the civil wars. The fact that Rome survived all these crises and emerged stronger speaks to advantages that accumulated over time but weren't guaranteed to work. The military system, the flexible legions that could adapt to any enemy and terrain, gave Rome tactical advantages. But many Roman battles were close-run things that could have gone either way. The alliance system, integrating defeated Italians into a network that provided troops for Roman wars, multiplied Roman power. But those alliances could have collapsed during crises like the Second Punic War when defection seemed rational. The political system, channeling aristocratic competition into military expansion, drove relentless warfare. But it also nearly destroyed Rome in the late Republic when competition became too intense to manage peacefully. Rome succeeded not through any single factor, but through the combination of military effectiveness, political resilience, strategic opportunism, and sheer stubborn refusal to accept defeat. These advantages compounded over time. Each successful war added territory, allies, wealth. More territory meant more resources for future wars. More allies meant more troops. More wealth meant better equipment and longer campaigns. Success bred success until Rome was so powerful that stopping its expansion required either its enemies to unite against it, which they rarely managed, or for Rome to stop itself, which it eventually did under the Principate. The human cost of this expansion was staggering. Millions died in Rome's wars, millions more were enslaved. Entire cities were destroyed. Whole peoples were displaced or exterminated. The Gauls, the Carthaginians, the Greeks, the peoples of Spain and Asia Minor all suffered terribly under Roman conquest. Rome's version of events, written by Roman historians to glorify Roman achievements, tends to minimize this suffering or portray it as the necessary price of bringing civilization to barbarians. But the reality was brutal. Roman conquest meant violence, death, enslavement, exploitation for those conquered. For the Romans themselves, the cost was also high. The wars that built the empire killed hundreds of thousands of Roman and Italian soldiers. The political violence of the late Republic murdered thousands more in proscriptions and civil wars. The social disruption, the destruction of the small farmer class, the concentration of wealth, the moral corruption that wealth and power brought, these transformed Roman society in ways that many Romans found disturbing and destructive. The question of whether the conquest was worth it depends on perspective. For the Roman elite who became fabulously wealthy and powerful, obviously yes. For the provinces that were exploited for centuries, obviously no. For the historians and later Europeans who saw Rome as the foundation of Western civilization, spreading law, language, culture, Christianity, probably yes. For the peoples whose cultures were destroyed or suppressed, probably no. There's no objective answer, just different values and priorities that lead to different judgments. What we can say objectively is that Rome's gradual conquest of the ancient world shaped history. Fundamentally, the empire created a political, cultural, and economic unity across the Mediterranean that had never existed before and wouldn't exist again for over a millennium. Roman law influenced European legal systems permanently. Latin evolved into the Romance languages. Roman Christianity became the dominant religion of Europe. Roman administrative practices influenced European governance. Roman engineering, architecture, literature all became part of the shared heritage of Western civilization. The gradual nature of the conquest mattered too. Because it happened over centuries rather than decades, Rome had time to develop the institutions and practices needed to govern an empire. The early experience governing Italian allies taught lessons applied later in overseas provinces. The disasters like Cannae taught resilience and flexibility. The civil wars taught eventually that the republican system couldn't handle empire and needed transformation into something else. This learning process, painful and expensive, meant that the empire Rome ultimately created was more stable and durable than if it had been established quickly through a few spectacular conquests. The boring details we've explored, the alliance system, the provincial administration, the military reforms, the tax collection, the legal innovations, these weren't dramatic, but they were essential. They explain how Rome actually conquered and governed. The famous battles, Cannae, Zama, Pharsalus, these are what people remember and what makes history exciting. But they're not what made Rome successful. Rome succeeded because it built systems that could absorb defeats, exploit victories, integrate conquered peoples, mobilize resources, and project power across vast distances over centuries. Those systems were boring. They were also revolutionary, creating the template for empire that later civilizations would study and sometimes imitate. In the end, Rome's gradual conquest of the ancient world was exactly that: gradual, step by step, war by war, province by province, alliance by alliance, reform by reform. Accumulated over 6 centuries by hundreds of thousands of soldiers, dozens of generals, scores of politicians, countless administrators, working within systems that gave Rome advantages its enemies couldn't match. Not because Romans were superior people, they weren't. Not because Rome was destined to rule, it wasn't. But because the specific combination of geographic position, political institutions, military practices, and cultural values, Rome created a self-reinforcing system of expansion that, once established, was nearly impossible to stop until it had conquered everything worth conquering in the ancient Mediterranean world. That's how Rome did it, not through genius or destiny, but through persistence, adaptation, and the boring, grinding work of building and maintaining the institutions that made empire possible. The dramatic moments happened. The battles were real. The great men made their mark. But underneath the drama was the tedious reality of administration, taxation, military logistics, legal proceedings, treaty negotiations, provincial governance, all the unglamorous work that actually sustained Roman power for the centuries it took to conquer the ancient world and the further centuries it took to govern it. And in that boring reality, in those administrative details and institutional practices, in the slow accumulation of small advantages and the patient building of systems, lies the real story of how Rome gradually took over the ancient world. Not overnight, not through dramatic inspiration, but through 6 centuries of relentless expansion, driven by systems that made conquest profitable and defeat temporary, until finally there were no unconquered territories worth taking, and Rome could stop, consolidate, and begin the long decline that would eventually return the Mediterranean to the fragmented competing political units that Rome had temporarily unified into the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen.